every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air over Cape Canaveral on the morning of January 28, 1986, was unnaturally cold. A rare and bitter Florida frost had settled overnight, coating the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center in a sheath of glittering ice. It was a cold that felt alien to the landscape of palm trees and wetlands, a premonition that hung unseen in the crystalline air. For the millions of Americans tuning in on their television sets, however, the day promised nothing but warmth and inspiration. This was not just another launch. This was the flight of the teacher. Krista McAuliffe, a vibrant high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, was about to become the first private citizen, the first ordinary American, to journey into the cosmos. She was the winner of the Teacher in Space Project, a Reagan-era initiative designed to reinvigorate public interest in the space program and remind the nation of its pioneering spirit. She was America's neighbor, her presence on board the Shuttle Challenger transforming mission STS-51L from a routine scientific endeavor into a shared national event. School children in classrooms across the country were gathered around televisions, ready to watch their teacher slip the bonds of Earth. On the launch pad, Challenger stood like a monument to human ambition, its massive external tank filled with over 500,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Strapped to its sides were the twin solid rocket boosters, the powerful engines that would provide the primary thrust for the first 2 minutes of flight. Inside the orbiter, the 7 astronauts were secured in their seats: Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, and mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, and of course, Krista McAuliffe. They were a cross-section of the best and brightest, a testament to a program that had seemingly made spaceflight routine almost mundane. The countdown was punctuated by delays, the cold being a persistent concern. Icicles, some several feet long, clung to the launch tower. There were debates among the mission managers about the potential risks posed by the ice, but the pressure to launch was immense. The flight had already been postponed multiple times. President Reagan was scheduled to give his State of the Union address that evening and had planned to celebrate the mission and its teacher in his speech. The machinery of a nation's pride was in motion, and it possessed a formidable momentum. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the final countdown reached its conclusion. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower. The voice of NASA launch commentator Hugh Harris was calm, professional, the familiar sound of controlled power. On screen, Challenger rose from the launch pad on a pillar of fire and steam, a beautiful, terrifying spectacle of raw energy. It ascended gracefully, arching out over the Atlantic Ocean, a white bird climbing into a perfect blue sky. For 73 seconds, everything was nominal. Challenger, go at throttle up. Mission Control radioed from Houston. Roger, go at throttle up, Commander Scobie replied. His voice was the last the world would ever hear from the crew. In that instant, as the shuttle accelerated through the sound barrier, a tiny, flickering orange flame appeared on the side of the right solid rocket booster. It was invisible to the ground, a fatal secret told only to the sky. The flame grew with astonishing speed, becoming a blowtorch that licked at the massive external fuel tank. Then it happened. In a heartbeat, the Space Shuttle Challenger ceased to exist. At an altitude of 46,000 feet, the external tank ruptured, unleashing its volatile contents into a massive instantaneous fireball. The orbiter itself, caught in the maelstrom of supersonic forces and aerodynamic stress, was torn apart. On television screens, the single brilliant contrail of the shuttle's ascent blossomed violently into a grotesque E-shaped cloud of white smoke, with tendrils of debris arcing away like fireworks in reverse. In mission control, there was a moment of stunned silence, a collective intake of breath, as professionals trained for any contingency struggled to comprehend what their screens were showing them. The data streams from the shuttle had vanished. Finally, the voice of NASA Public Affairs Officer Steve Nesbitt broke the silence, his words forever etched into the consciousness of a generation. Flight controllers here are looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously, a major malfunction. The world saw a technical failure, a horrific accident, a tragedy born of the inherent risks of exploration. But the truth was buried deeper, not in the twisted metal falling into the ocean, but in a chain of human decisions, in a series of whispered warnings and heated arguments that took place in the hours and years leading up to that frozen January morning. This was not an accident. It was an inevitability, set in motion by a system that had taught itself to ignore the very people who knew it best. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we are not dissecting a case of malice or murder in the traditional sense. We are dissecting a far more complex and insidious kind of crime, a crime of institutional failure. We will examine the anatomy of a disaster, piecing together the engineering flaws, the management pressures, and the culture of willful ignorance that sent 7 people to their deaths while a nation watched. We will uncover how a known fatal flaw was systematically downplayed until it became a risk someone was willing to take. This is the story of the Space Shuttle Challenger, and the 73 seconds that were not a beginning, but an end. To understand how the disaster of STS-51L could happen, we must first understand the machine at its heart and the promise it was built to fulfill. The Space Shuttle program was born from the ashes of the Apollo era. After the monumental success of landing a man on the moon, NASA found itself in an existential crisis. Its budget was slashed, and public attention waned. The agency needed a new flagship program, something that would define the next generation of space exploration. The vision was for a reusable space plane, a workhorse vehicle that could fly dozens of times a year, making access to orbit cheap, reliable, and routine. It was meant to be the spacefaring equivalent of a commercial airline. This ambition, however, was incredibly difficult and expensive to realize. The final design of the Space Transportation System, or STS, was a marvel of engineering, but also a monument to compromise. It consisted of the orbiter, the iconic delta-winged spaceplane, a massive external fuel tank that fed the orbiter's main engines during ascent, and 2 solid rocket boosters, or SRBs, strapped to the sides of the tank. These SRBs were the most powerful solid propellant motors ever flown. They were also, from an engineering standpoint, the system's most vulnerable component. Unlike liquid-fueled engines that can be throttled or shut down, a solid rocket motor, once ignited, burns until its fuel is exhausted. It is, in essence, a controlled explosion. The SRBs for the shuttle were so massive they had to be manufactured in segments in Utah by the contractor Morton Thiokol, and then transported by rail to Florida for assembly. Where these segments were joined together, they were sealed by a system of interlocking tangs and clevises, along with 2 crucial rubber seals known as O-rings. These O-rings, each about 1/4 of an inch thick, and running the entire 37-foot circumference of the booster, were designed to contain the searingly hot, high-pressure gases of combustion. If they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. It would be like a crack appearing in the barrel of a cannon. From the very beginning of the shuttle program, the O-rings were a source of concern for the engineers at Morton Thiokol and at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, which managed the booster program. As early as 1977, tests revealed a fundamental design flaw. During ignition, the immense internal pressure caused the booster's steel casing to bow outwards, a phenomenon known as joint rotation. This rotation could create a momentary gap, unseating the primary O-ring and preventing it from forming a proper seal. The secondary O-ring was there as a backup, but depending on a backup for a mission-critical component was a violation of one of NASA's foundational safety principles. The problem was not theoretical. On the second shuttle flight STS-2 in 1981, post-flight analysis of the recovered boosters showed significant erosion, or heat damage, on an O-ring. The hot gases had blown past the primary seal. This phenomenon, known as blowby, was a terrifying sign that the system was not working as designed. Throughout the early 1980s, as the shuttle flew more and more missions, the evidence mounted. O-ring erosion was found on nearly half the flights. In January of 1985, a full year before the Challenger disaster, a launch in similarly cold weather on Shuttle Discovery resulted in the worst O-ring blowby ever seen. Both the primary and secondary O-rings in one joint were damaged. The mission had come perilously close to disaster. This pattern of accepting flaws is what sociologist Diane Vaughan would later call the normalization of deviance. A problem that is initially shocking becomes less so with each successful flight. The O-ring erosion went from being an alarming anomaly to an acceptable risk. It was documented, tracked, and discussed in endless meetings. But the fundamental danger was gradually diluted by a string of successful missions. NASA and Thiokol engineers created a waiver system, essentially giving themselves permission to fly with a known flaw that violated their own design criteria. The system was broken, but it kept working just long enough for people to start believing the brokenness was normal. The crew of STS-51L was a microcosm of the American dream. Their mission was symbolic of a new era for NASA, one that was meant to be inclusive and accessible. At its helm was Francis Dick Scobie, a 46-year-old Air Force veteran and a seasoned astronaut on his second spaceflight. His pilot was Michael J. Smith, a 40-year-old Navy captain on his first. The mission specialists were a diverse group of brilliant minds. Ellison Onizuka was the first Asian American in space. Ronald McNair was the second African American, a physicist with a PhD from MIT who was also an accomplished saxophonist. Judith Resnick, another veteran of a previous flight, was an electrical engineer with a doctorate. Known for her sharp intellect and boundless energy, Gregory Jarvis was an engineer for the Hughes Aircraft Company, a payload specialist representing the commercial future of space. And then there was Krista McAuliffe. Selected from over 11,000 applicants, she was charismatic, relatable, and deeply passionate about education. Her role was not just to perform experiments, but to communicate the wonder of space to a new generation. She planned to conduct televised lessons from orbit, simple science demonstrations about magnetism, hydroponics, and Newton's laws. Her presence on the flight elevated its public profile to a level not seen since the Apollo missions. The pressure on NASA to launch on time and put on a good show was immense. This flight couldn't just succeed, it had to be a public relations triumph. The fatal combination of factors began to converge in the 24 hours before launch. The weather forecast for Cape Canaveral was unusually severe, with temperatures predicted to drop into the low 20s Fahrenheit overnight. This was far colder than any previous shuttle launch. For the engineers at methodical in Utah, this set off alarm bells. One engineer in particular, Roger Boisjoli, had been warning his superiors about the effect of cold on O-ring performance for months. He knew from test data that the rubber material used for the O-rings lost its resiliency at low temperatures. Like a frozen rubber band, it would become stiff and would not seat properly in the crucial milliseconds after ignition. A cold O-ring would not be able to create a seal against the torrent of hot gas. On the evening of January 27th, the night before the launch, a tense and ultimately fateful teleconference took place between engineers and managers at methodical and their counterparts at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and Kennedy Space Center. The Thiokol engineers, led by Boisjoli and his colleague, Arnie Thompson, presented their data with a grave sense of urgency. They showed charts and graphs demonstrating the correlation between temperature and O-ring damage on previous flights. Their conclusion was unambiguous and unanimous. Launching in the predicted low temperatures was a gamble with catastrophic odds. They recommended, in the strongest possible terms, that the launch be postponed until the temperature rose to at least 53 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest temperature of any previous launch. Their recommendation was met with disbelief and resistance from the NASA managers on the line. At Marshall, the center director Larry Malloy was particularly incredulous. He challenged the engineers' data, arguing that it was inconclusive. He pointed out that some warm weather launches had also shown O-ring erosion. To him, the engineers were trying to introduce a new launch constraint on the eve of a major flight. The pressure he and his team were under was palpable. A delay would be another black eye for a program struggling to meet its ambitious schedule of nearly 24 flights per year. The conversation grew heated. At one point, George Hardy, another senior NASA official from Marshall, was heard to say he was appalled by Thiokol's recommendation. But the most damning statement came from Malloy himself. Frustrated with the engineers' refusal to back down, he issued a challenge that would echo through the halls of history. "My God, Thiokol," he said, "when do you want me to launch?" "Next April." The message was clear. This was not a technical discussion. It was a test of loyalty. NASA needed its contractor to be a team player. The Thiokol managers felt the pressure acutely. Joe Kilminster, their vice president of space booster programs, turned to his team. He asked for a 5-minute caucus off the main teleconference line. In that private meeting, the soul of the company was put on the line. Roger Boisjoli argued passionately, even desperately, for his position. He later recalled spreading photos of damaged O-rings on the conference table, pleading with his superiors to look at the evidence and not give in to NASA's pressure. He felt they were on the verge of making a terrible mistake. But the senior Thiokol manager in the room, Gerald Mason, had a different perspective. He turned to Bob Lund, the vice president of engineering, and made a request that would become infamous. He told Lund to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. It was a pivotal moment. He was asking his top engineer to stop thinking about the physical data and start thinking about the business relationship with their biggest client, NASA. Under this immense pressure, Lund, who had initially supported the no-launch recommendation, faltered. the managers decided to overrule their own engineers. When Thiokol rejoined the main teleconference, Joe Kilminster read a new recommendation. They had reassessed the data and now believed it was safe to launch. The new rationale was a convoluted piece of logic that attempted to prove the O-rings would seal despite the cold. It was exactly what the NASA managers wanted to hear. The concerns of the engineers had been officially silenced. In Florida, Alan McDonald, the senior Thiokol representative at the launch site, was horrified. He had listened to the entire exchange and believed the launch was unsafe. He refused to sign the official launch recommendation form, telling his NASA counterparts, "If anything happens to this launch, I wouldn't want to be the person that has to stand in front of a board of inquiry to explain why I launched." His words were prophetic. The decision, however, had been made. The countdown would proceed. As dawn broke on January 28th, the launch pad was an Arctic landscape. An ice team was dispatched to inspect the structure, knocking down huge icicles with poles. Concerns were raised that falling ice during launch could strike and damage the orbiter's delicate thermal protection tiles. These concerns, too, were ultimately overridden. The momentum of Go Fever was now unstoppable. The final decision to launch rested with the senior NASA mission managers, who had been assured by their subordinates that the O-ring issue was resolved. The chain of command had effectively filtered out the dissent, passing only a message of confidence up to the top. In the final minutes of the countdown, the 7 astronauts of STS-51L lay on their backs, unaware of the life-or-death debate that had taken place the night before. They had faith in the system, in the thousands of engineers and technicians who supported them. They had no reason to believe that the system had, in a critical moment, failed them. At T-minus 6.6 seconds, the shuttle's 3 main engines roared to life. At T0, the command was sent to ignite the 2 solid rocket boosters. At the moment of ignition, the immense pressure of 4 million pounds of thrust caused the booster casings to bulge as predicted. In the aft field joint of the right SRB, the primary O-ring, hardened and stiffened by the cold, failed to seat properly in its groove. A fraction of a second later, the secondary O-ring also failed to seal the gap. For the first time in shuttle history, a direct path was opened from the fiery heart of the rocket motor to the outside world. Cameras on the launch pad captured what happened next. At 0.678 seconds after ignition, 8 distinct puffs of dark gray smoke escaped from the joint. This was the smoking gun, the proof that the seal had been breached from the very start. The smoke continued for nearly 3 seconds before the joint apparently sealed itself again, likely plugged by byproducts of the solid rocket propellant. For a brief moment, it seemed the system had narrowly averted disaster. The shuttle cleared the tower and began its powerful ascent. But the temporary plug was just that, temporary. The scorching gases had damaged the O-rings and filled the joint with hot soot. For the next minute, Challenger flew a seemingly perfect trajectory. Then, at around 58 seconds into the flight, the shuttle encountered the period of maximum aerodynamic pressure, known as max Q. The vehicle was buffeted by powerful wind shear, and the temporary seal in the damaged joint gave way. A small, almost imperceptible flicker of flame emerged from the side of the right SRB. This time, there was no resealing. The flame grew rapidly into a plume, acting like a plasma torch aimed directly at the struts that held the booster to the massive external fuel tank. At the same time, the flame began to burn through the surface of the tank itself, which contained hundreds of thousands of gallons of supercooled liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Inside the cockpit, the crew likely had no idea what was happening. The first and only indication of a problem may have been a brief flicker of their instruments or a slight change in the vehicle's motion. Pilot Michael Smith was the first to voice concern. His last recorded words, captured only on the cockpit voice recorder, were a simple, questioning "uh-oh." It was the sound of a professional realizing, in his final second of life, that something was profoundly wrong. At 73.1 seconds, the lower strut connecting the right SRB to the external tank failed. The booster pivoted, its nose cone striking the intertank area of the external tank. Simultaneously, the compromised bottom of the liquid hydrogen tank failed. The hydrogen vented, pushing the shuttle sideways into the supersonic airstream. The vehicle was subjected to aerodynamic forces it was never designed to withstand. The external tank disintegrated, creating the massive fireball seen on television. The orbiter, with the crew cabin intact, was torn away, tumbling uncontrollably. The common belief is that the astronauts died instantly in an explosion. The reality, as determined by the subsequent investigation, is far more harrowing. There was no explosion in the traditional sense. It was a structural breakup in midair. The crew cabin, a reinforced module, remained largely intact and continued on a ballistic trajectory, reaching an altitude of about 65,000 feet before beginning its long fall toward the Atlantic Ocean. The investigation into the wreckage revealed a chilling detail. Several of the emergency air packs provided for the astronauts, known as personal egress air packs, PEAPs, had been manually activated. At least 3 were found to have been turned on, including pilot Michael Smith's. This strongly suggests that at least some of the crew members survived the initial breakup of the orbiter. They were conscious, aware, and fighting for their lives during the 2 minutes and 45 seconds it took for the cabin to plummet into the sea. The ultimate cause of their death was impact with the ocean surface at over 200 miles per hour. This grim possibility adds an almost unbearable layer of tragedy to the event, transforming it from a swift, impersonal accident into a prolonged private horror. The immediate aftermath of the disaster was a period of national mourning. President Reagan postponed his State of the Union address and instead spoke to the nation from the Oval Office that evening. His speech, written by Peggy Noonan, was a masterpiece of solace and resolve, concluding with the memorable lines, "We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning," as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. But behind the scenes of public grief, a frantic search for answers was beginning. NASA immediately impounded all launch data and documentation and began its own internal investigation. However, it quickly became clear that the agency could not be trusted to investigate itself. The White House announced the formation of a presidential commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger accident, to be chaired by former Secretary of State William Rogers. The commission was filled with respected figures, including astronauts Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride, and test pilot Chuck Yeager. But its most influential and dogged member would prove to be a Nobel Prize-winning physicist from Caltech named Richard Feynman. Feynman was a brilliant, iconoclastic, and fiercely independent thinker. He had no patience for bureaucracy or obfuscation, and from the moment he arrived in Washington, he began to clash with the carefully managed, tight-lipped culture of NASA. While the rest of the Rogers Commission attended formal briefings, Feynman went his own way, talking directly to mid-level engineers and technicians, the people who actually worked on the shuttle. He quickly grew frustrated with NASA management, who he felt were giving him the runaround, burying him in acronyms and technical jargon while evading his simple, direct questions. The turning point in the investigation came from the testimony of the Morton Thiokol engineers. Initially, the company and NASA presented a united front, portraying the disaster as an unforeseeable event. But Alan MacDonald, the Thiokol representative who had refused to sign the launch papers, knew the truth. He and other engineers, including Roger Boisjoli, began to talk. They told the Commission about the contentious teleconference the night before the launch, about their explicit warnings regarding the cold weather, and about the pressure from NASA management that led Thiokol to reverse its no-launch recommendation. This was the bombshell the Commission needed. It transformed the investigation from a technical inquiry into a probe of a deeply flawed decision-making process. The focus shifted from what failed to why it was allowed to fail. The Commission learned about the long history of O-ring problems, the normalization of deviance, and the communication breakdown that prevented the engineers' critical safety concerns from reaching the top levels of launch authority. Feynman, armed with this knowledge, decided to make the issue undeniably public. On February 11, 1986, during a televised public hearing of the Commission, he conducted a simple, brilliant experiment. He got a small C-clamp, a glass of ice water, and a sample of the O-ring rubber material. As the cameras rolled, he clamped the rubber sample and submerged it in the ice water for a few minutes to simulate the conditions on launch morning. When he removed it, he took off the clamp. The rubber did not spring back to its original shape. It remained compressed, stiff, and lifeless. Turning to the Commission and the assembled press, Feynman stated plainly, "I believe that has some significance for our problem." In that single dramatic moment, he had cut through all the jargon and bureaucracy. He demonstrated, in a way the entire world could understand, the fundamental physical flaw at the heart of the disaster. The O-rings would not work in the cold. It was a failure of basic physics, a truth that had been known by engineers but ignored by managers. The final report of the Rogers Commission, released on June 9, 1986, was a damning indictment of NASA and its contractor Morton Thiokol. The report confirmed that the cause of the disaster was the failure of the pressure seal in the aft field joint of the right solid rocket booster. But it went much further, citing the flawed decision-making process as a critical contributing cause. It detailed the communication failures, the pressure to meet an unrealistic launch schedule, and a safety structure that was silent and ineffective. The report exposed a deep cultural sickness within NASA. The agency that had once exemplified meticulous planning and engineering excellence with the Apollo program had become a bureaucracy more concerned with schedules, budgets, and public relations than with the safety of its astronauts. The can-do spirit that had put a man on the moon had morphed into a dangerous go fever, an institutional momentum that rolled over any obstacle, including the desperate warnings of its own engineers. The Commission found that the decision to launch Challenger was not merely a mistake made in the heat of the moment. It was the culmination of years of self-deception, of a system that had lost its way. The consequences were profound. The Space Shuttle program was grounded for 32 months. The SRBs were completely redesigned, with a new joint that included a third O-ring and an internal heating element. NASA's management structure was overhauled, with a renewed emphasis on safety and a clearer line of communication between engineers and decision-makers. Roger Boisjoli, The Thiokol engineer, who had tried so desperately to stop the launch, left the company and became a leading advocate for engineering ethics, lecturing at universities across the country about the moral responsibility of engineers to speak up, even at great personal cost. The legacy of the Challenger is a complex one. For the families of the 7 astronauts, it is a story of personal loss that never fades. For the nation, it was a collective trauma, a moment when the illusion of technological infallibility was shattered. It served as a brutal lesson that ambition, without a commensurate sense of caution and humility, can lead to ruin. The disaster exposed the dangerous gap that can form between the people who understand a risk and the people who have the power to accept it. The story of the Challenger 7 did not end in that terrible fireball 73 seconds after liftoff. It continues to echo through the decades as a cautionary tale. It is taught in engineering schools, in business ethics courses, and in studies of organizational behavior. It reminds us that the most critical component in any complex system is not a piece of hardware or a line of code, but human integrity. It is about the courage to listen to a dissenting voice, the wisdom to heed a warning, and the character to choose safety over schedule. In dissecting the anatomy of this institutional failure, we find that the fatal flaw was not in a rubber o-ring, but in the human chain of command. The o-ring was merely the point where a long-standing organizational pathology became physically manifest. The disaster was not caused by the cold of a Florida morning, but by a chilling deafness in the halls of power. It was a failure born of pressure, of hubris, and of the profound and tragic consequences that unfold when the people in charge stop listening. The final, silent moments of the crew of STS-51L, falling through the vast, empty sky, stand as the ultimate testament to this failure. Their journey was meant to be a symbol of humanity's reach for the stars, a celebration of knowledge and exploration. Instead, it became a permanent, searing reminder of the price of ignoring the truth. The plume of smoke that scarred the sky that morning was not just the ghost of a machine. It was the physical shape of a warning that went unheard. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.